Hello everyone, my name is Paul Schuler, and today I'm going to be presenting the national findings from this year's PAPI survey. I'm going to divide this presentation into two parts. The first part's going to look at the overall changes in the PAPI indicators, and in particular I'm going to look at how some of those indicators have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also I'm going to look at how changes in governance quality in Vietnam have also impacted Vietnam's ability to deal with the coronavirus pandemic and how that may have contributed to Vietnam's successful response. So that's going to be the first section of the presentation. For the second section of the presentation, I'm going to look at areas of greatest concern for Vietnamese citizens in 2020, those issues that Vietnamese citizens want the government to address most in the upcoming year. So with that in mind, let's start with the first section. I'm going to look here at an overview of governance and public administrative performance from 2011 to 2020 and how the COVID-19 response has impacted governance scores, but also how governance scores have impacted Vietnam's response to the coronavirus pandemic. So I'm going to start here just to look at the overall trends in the aggregate PAPI indicators from 2011 till 2020. And what you can see on this graph is to the left of the orange dotted line. This is the 2011 to 2015 government term. And then to the right of the orange dotted line is the 2016 to 2021 government term. And what this graph indicates is that for the 2011 to 2015 government term, really, there was stagnation in terms of improvement in the PAPI indicators, meaning that governance, at least in the eyes of citizens, wasn't improving. However, after 2016, we can see nearly continuous year-on-year improvement in the PAPI indicators, such that in the previous year, 2020, the PAPI scores were at its highest level since the survey started in 2011. Now, looking specifically within the dimensions that comprise the PAPI, these are the 6 dimensions that PAPI has been measuring every year since 2011. So these are the 6 core dimensions of the PAPI index. And what stands out on this graph is that there are two dimensions that really have driven the improvement in the PAPI scores from 2019 to 2020. The first dimension that I want you to pay attention to is this orange, bold orange line. This is dimension 4, control of corruption in the public sector. We can see that since 2016, with the beginning of the Blazing Furnace anti-corruption campaign, we can see that control of corruption has improved basically every year since 2016. The other indicator that's also improved is the yellow dotted line, which is dimension 3, vertical accountability. And what you can see is that from 2019 to 2020, there was a sharp increase or sharp spike in this particular indicator. So I'm going to go through those dimensions specifically over the next couple slides to show you why these scores have improved. So looking first at control of corruption, this of course is the most important dimension in PAPI every year with regards to the impact of governance on satisfaction with local government. Every year, dimension 4 is the dimension that's most strongly correlated with overall satisfaction with government. And we can see in terms of why this dimension is improved. If you look at the need to pay bribes, whether citizens think that bribes are necessary to acquire public services or public administrative procedures, you can see with regard to bribe taking, the perception of having to pay bribes has improved every year since 2016. So the amount of citizens saying they somewhat agree or agree that bribes are necessary for instance, getting state employment, land use rights certificates, public health care services, construction permits, or education services has improved every year. Now, one thing to take note of, however, with regard to the corruption indicators is the previous slide is mainly measuring perceptions. So these are citizens being asked whether or not bribes are necessary, regardless of whether or not they actually try to access one of those administrative procedures or public service. When we look at this graph, this, however, is an analysis limited to only those who try to acquire a land use right certificate or try to actually use hospital services in the previous year. And we designed the question in a special way that you can look at the report to get the details, but we designed this question to make sure that citizens could answer honestly without being fearful that they would have to admit on the survey that they actually had to pay a bribe. And when we look at people who have actually experienced one of these procedures, we can see that in contrast to the perceptions, bribes for land use right certificates actually reached its highest level since 2015 and 2020. Now, however, with regard to public health care, we do see that actually bribes have gone down with regard to paying bribes to doctors for public health care services. And so this paints a bit more of a complicated picture with regard to anti-corruption. While it seems clear that the anti-corruption campaign has improved the perception of corruption in Vietnam, with regard to actual experience with corruption, the evidence is a bit more mixed. I want to now shift to dimension 3, which is vertical accountability, as this was one of the other dimensions that saw a lot of improvement from 2019 to 2020. And one of the components of this dimension is whether or not citizens contacted one of their local officials in the previous year. And as you can see on this graph, this is largely the reason why dimension 3 improved in 2020. We can see with regard to citizens who contacted a village head in the previous year, there was a dramatic jump from 23% to 28% in 2020. With regard to contacting a local Communist People's Council delegate, there was also a similar spike in number of people saying they contacted their local Communist People's Council delegate. What this seems to indicate is that when the coronavirus hit and when the government started to implement a large number of policies designed to limit the spread of coronavirus, as well as distributing funds to needy citizens, there was a great more deal of contact between citizens and their local officials. And so what this improvement in dimension 3 seems to indicate is that these local officials really are an important conduit between the state and citizens in the time of a national emergency. Now, the next thing I wanted to look at with regard to the national indicators is this question I opened with in the brief introduction, which was whether or not Vietnam's improvement in governance scores have affected its ability to deliver the successful response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which it was able to do in 2020. Now, in terms of Vietnam's successful response, there's been a number of different factors that people have pointed to. Perhaps Vietnam's non-polarized political environment, perhaps its previous experience with SARS, are some of the reasons why Vietnam has been able to limit the spread of coronavirus. In this particular analysis, we wanted to look to see whether or not improved governance has been another factor that's improved Vietnam's ability to limit the spread of coronavirus. Now, one of the reasons why governance quality might help a government respond to a crisis is that if citizens are more trusting in the government, if government services are provided in a more transparent way, and citizens trust government more, this might make them more willing to accept restrictive policies that the government tries to get them to implement in order to limit the spread. And so in the next couple slides, we tried to look at this to see whether or not Vietnamese citizens were more willing to accept dramatic lockdown measures if their experience with local government had been better in previous years. And so one of the questions we used to analyze this is a question that asked citizens whether or not compliance in their area with the April 2020 national lockdown order, whether that compliance in their area was low, neither low nor high, or high. As this graph shows, more than 90% of people in Vietnam thought that compliance with the lockdown measure in their province was high or very high. So what we then wanted to look at is to see whether or not local experience with governance impacted the degree to which citizens in a given province were willing to comply with the lockdown measure. And so we did an analysis looking at a correlation between the overall PAPI indicators, the aggregate index, and compliance at the provincial level with the lockdown order. And that showed that a 1-point increase in the overall PAPI aggregate score led to about a 1% increase in overall compliance with the lockdown order. Now, looking specifically within the dimensions that comprise the PAPI index, we can see here on this graph that the two dimensions that are most strongly correlated with compliance with the COVID measures are dimension 4, control of corruption in the public sector, where a 1-point increase in this score at the provincial level in 2019 led to a 1.5% increase in compliance with the lockdown order, as well as dimension 1, participation at local levels, where a 1-point increase in this dimension led to a 3.1% increase in compliance with this measure. And so this seems to indicate, again, that not only is improving governance useful for the delivery of public services in normal times, but it also helps the government be able to respond to crises and gain the support and trust of their citizens. Now finally, before I turn to the issues of most important concern, I also wanted to look briefly at differences in experience with governance between men and women, to see whether women have different experiences with governance than men. And when we look at the different dimensions, we can see that on 3 of these dimensions, there's not a substantial difference in how women experience governance compared to men. So in terms of control of corruption, public administrative procedures, public service delivery, not a big difference. However, on the first 3 dimensions, which really speak to interactions between local officials and citizens, we do see that women are less likely to engage with local politicians, and local politicians are less likely to engage with women, which accounts for the lower scores on these first 3 dimensions between men and women. Also, interestingly, when we look at the differences in perspectives, we can see on dimension 8, e-governance, women have a much lower score in terms of rating e-governance at the provincial level compared to men. And this seems to be driven in our analysis, as you can see in the report, by the fact that women are much less likely to report having access to the internet. And so as Vietnam continues to expand and roll out e-governance procedures, attention needs to be paid to equity in terms of access between men and women. So in looking at the overall aggregate PAPI index, some of the key findings are that there's incremental improvements in governance and public administration at the national level, especially in the 2016 to 21 government term. And there is evidence that this improvement has led to an increased ability for the government to implement some of its successful COVID-19 responses. Corruption in the public sector is also an area that's improved, although there are some concerns about actual experience with corruption as it pertains to perceptions of corruption. We also have some evidence that citizens were increasingly contacting local officials during the COVID pandemic, and there are continued large gender gaps in citizen participation in e-governance. And so some implications are that better governance may lead to better responses to unexpected crises. Continued attention should be paid to addressing corruption in order to build public trust. Village leaders continue to play a proactive role as interlocutors between citizens and the state. And the government should respond to women's concerns and women's ability to access government resources. I want to shift now to one of the issues that we always look at in the PAPI survey, which is the issues that citizens feel the government should address in the next year. And to assess this question, one of the things that we've asked every year since 2015 is to name one of the top 3 issues that the government should address in the upcoming year. And we ask this question in an open-ended way so citizens can respond with whatever issue they wish. What we can see on this graph is, as with previous years, poverty reduction and hunger reduction is the most important concern in the minds of citizens, with about almost 18% of citizens responding that this was the most important issue. We can see health and health insurance, likely due to the coronavirus pandemic, is the second most important concern, and then economic concerns, economic growth and GDP growth being the second highest concern. Now, if we look at the change over time in some of these key indicators, I think it becomes increasingly clear how much the COVID-19 pandemic has shifted citizen priorities. So while poverty and hunger reduction is an important concern, it drops from its highest level in 2017 at 26% down to 17% in 2020. Where you can see the biggest difference or biggest change is in people who are concerned about health or health insurance. That number has shifted from 1.6% of people who said this was the most important issue in 2019 up to 15.5% in 2020. So a dramatic increase in the number of citizens who think that healthcare and health insurance is their number 1 priority. We can also see an increase in the number of citizens responding that growth and GDP growth is their most important issue, going from about 10.6% to more than 13% in 2020. And so healthcare and economic concerns dramatically increased in terms of their salience in the minds of citizens as the COVID pandemic spread across Vietnam. Now, looking at gender differences in the issues of greatest concern, we can see that there are some gender distinctions. There are issues that women are more likely to care about than men, and vice versa. So if we look at the issues that women are most likely to identify as concerns, women are 10% more likely to say poverty and hunger reduction are important concerns. They're also more likely to say that health or health insurance is a more important concern. Men, on the other hand, are more likely to concentrate on the East Sea dispute, national defense, or economic growth and GDP growth. Now I wanted to conclude with a few slides to look at how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted citizens' overall evaluations of the economy. And so we have two questions that we're going to look at very briefly, which is first asking citizens how their own personal economic situation has evolved in the previous year. And then we're going to ask how Vietnamese citizens have evaluated the overall Vietnamese economy. Now on this first graph, we can see that there has been a slight decline in satisfaction with personal economic situation as compared to 2019, although it's not a huge discrepancy. So in 2020, we saw a slight increase in the number of citizens who said that their economic situation was poor or very poor. And we can also see a slight decrease in the number of citizens saying their economic situation was good or very good. However, when we shift to asking about the overall Vietnamese economy, we can see much more dramatic changes. When we look at this set of questions, we can see that there's been a jump from 4% of people who responded that the overall Vietnamese economy was bad in 2019, jumping to 11.3% in 2020. And there's been a dramatic decline in the number of people who are saying the overall Vietnamese economic situation is good, going from 67.5% to 57.5% in 2020. Now, the increased pessimism with regard to the overall economic situation is likely a function of the fact that many Vietnamese citizens either lost jobs or lost income in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. And so the PAPI survey in 2020 asked citizens whether or not they did lose income or lose a job as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what you can see on the left is that virtually every province was impacted by COVID in terms of job losses, with some provinces shaded in the dark red region having more than 45% of their citizens saying they lost jobs in the previous year. And as you can see, this is heavily concentrated in central and north central Vietnam. Now, if we look at loss of income, we can see that basically every province had more than 40% of people saying they lost income in the previous year, with some provinces, again, in the central region, saying that 85% of people saying that they lost income in the previous year. And so again, despite the fact that Vietnam has performed well in terms of mitigating the economic fallout of COVID-19 as compared to other Southeast Asian countries, we can still see nonetheless that the economic damage has been widespread, which has led to the increased pessimism with the overall economic situation. So some key findings and implications coming out of this examination of issues of greatest concern for citizens are that poverty reduction remains a key priority for citizens. COVID-19 has increased the importance of healthcare and economic development in the minds of citizens. Citizens and respondents were more pessimistic about both national and household economic situations, likely due to job losses and income losses because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And when we look at gender differences and issues of greatest concern, women are far more concerned about poverty, hunger, and healthcare and education than men, where men tend to focus more on economic growth and national security concerns. The implications of all this is that while the overall response in Vietnam to the COVID-19 pandemic has been good, the government is still nonetheless going to face significant challenges in terms of meeting citizen expectations with regard to the economic conditions in Vietnam and the health sector challenges the country is going to face. So despite the fact that Vietnam has performed well, there's still going to be challenges it's going to face moving forward. And additionally, in terms of the issue priorities that citizens have, we still see substantial gender differences in those issues that citizens care about, highlighting the need for equitable representation in elected bodies, which is going to be the subject of one of the other presentations that you're going to hear today. With that, I want to thank you for your attention and hope you all have a great day.